Hello everyone. So we have now finished Unit 3, which covered Chapters 7, 8, and 9, and so now we get to go over the review for the exam. So let's get right into it with Chapter 7. And the very first thing that you are going to need to know is what thinking is and how we define thinking. And so for the sake of this class, we define thinking as the process of representing and manipulating information in our mind. So that's the first thing that you're going to need to know. And as always, I am going to be going through these relatively quickly. This is because this is just a review. I go into more detail in each individual chapter's video or modules. So the next thing that you will need to know is this idea of a logical concept versus natural. And the one to be focusing on for the sake of the exam is a logical concept, because a logical concept is one that has clearly defined rules for determining membership. So the example is in math. There's a lot of very specific equations, and as long as you plug it in correctly, you get the right answer. So that is a logical concept. The next thing that you'll need to know is insight, and what we mean by insight. And insight is when you just suddenly have this sudden awareness of a solution to a problem. So it just suddenly pops into your head, and all of a sudden you just know the solution. That's an example of insight. Another thing that is not specifically on the PowerPoint, but something I talked about in class, is this idea of sub-goals. And sub-goals are when you're breaking down a problem into more manageable bits, or sub-goals. So it's breaking down those goals into more manageable parts. And that's what we mean by a sub-goal. The next thing you're going to need to know about is this whole idea of functional fixedness. And we talked about this very briefly in class, and I believe I provided a video about it. But the two-string problem and the box candle problem are both examples where you have to use objects in new ways to solve the problem. So if people fail the two-string problem or the box candle problem, it means that they are stuck in functional fixedness. So knowing what that word is will help. There's an animation that shows, how you use things differently than you would originally use them. All right, the next thing is this idea of representative heuristic. This is the whole idea that you assume, because again, heuristics are just, assumptions, they're shortcuts that we take. You assume that a smaller sample then represents the larger population. So you meet one person of a specific race, and you then decide that everyone of that race is like that person. That's a representative heuristic. Another thing is this idea of divergent versus convergent thinking. The one to focus on, again, for the sake of the exam, is convergent, where there is a single answer to a problem. So convergent is when there is one single solution to a problem. All right, there's two different things that's on here, and I apologize if the words are a little off. So what you will need to know, and do not mix this up, but morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in a language. So when we talk about the smallest unit of meaning, we mean morphemes. The other thing on this slide that you will need to know is the idea of semantics. And this is what derives the meaning of a word. So again, both of the examples, both of the questions on the exam have to do with meaning. The smallest unit of meaning is morphemes, and then the rules that govern the meaning of a word are what we call semantics. Then we have Noam Chomsky. The thing to know about him, and I remember that the question on the exam is a little wordy with this, but when you see Noam Chomsky, know that it is the whole idea that we have this kind of innate or naturally acquired language device. So it means that we have this natural device in our brains that just seems to be thirsty for language. So an innate or natural mechanism in our brain for language. That's what you should think of when you see Noam Chomsky. Next thing is intelligence. And so understanding what intelligence is, how we define intelligence, and while there's many different ways For the sake of class, we're going to use the book definition. So it is the capacity to think and reason clearly and to act purposefully and effectively in adapting to the environment and pursuing one's goal. So that's the definition that you're going to be looking for intelligence. Or if you see that definition, you'll know that what we're talking about is intelligence. And speaking of intelligence, you will also need to know the way of calculating your intelligence quotient, or your IQ, which is listed up here. And it is your mental age divided by your actual age, and then multiplied by 100. So you'll see various options on the exam, and so be very careful that you're picking the right one. It is the mental age divided by the actual age, and then multiplied by 100. Alright, there's a few things on this slide. You will first need to know the difference between reliability versus validity. Reliability means that you are getting the same results over and over and over again. So you're getting the same score. It's reliable. It yields consistent results. So getting the same score. Validity, on the other hand, is when it's actually testing or measuring what it's supposed to. So measuring what it's supposed to measure. So like using a thermometer to measure temperature. That is a valid way to measure temperature. The other thing that you will need to know that's on this slide is standardization. And essentially it means that you are giving a test in the way that it is the same for everyone. So a standardized test means that everyone takes the test at the same time, everyone has the same amount of time, everyone answers in pencil, everyone is using a Scantron where they're bubbling in their answers. Everything is the same. And that is an example of standardization. Next thing is Spearman. The thing to remember about Spearman is he is the one that had this idea of a G factor, which is your general intelligence. The way that I remember this is I think spearmint gum, so Spearman G factor. So if you see G factor, you know that we're talking about Spearman. Another thing when we talk about Gardner's model of multiple intelligences, the one that we are focusing on for the exam is this interpersonal, because a lot of people mix it up with intrapersonal. Interpersonal is your social skills, so your ability to communicate with others, to understand others. So if you see a question on the exam that has to do with your people skills, that is an example of interpersonal skills, or intelligence. And then we have Sternberg. I've talked about him before when I did the psychology of love, and I said that he's obsessed with triangles. That's because he always has triarchic theories. So essentially, he sees intelligence as having three main parts. So if you see a question that has to do with a theorist that had three main parts of intelligence or forms of intelligence, that is Sternberg with his triarchic theory of intelligence. So now we get on to the next chapter. We're into chapter 8. And like with a lot of chapters, we start with the definition. So you will need to know the definition of motivation, and it is all the processes that activate, direct, and sustain goal-directed behavior. So it is all three of those things: activating, directing, and sustaining goal-directed behavior. That is motivation. And then when we talk about various ways that we are motivated, there is the drive theory. And the thing to remember about the drive theory is that Clark Hull is the one that is the biggest idea of this drive theory. And the way that I remember it is you have to drive a U-Haul. So Clark Hull is the drive theory. Another thing on this slide that you will need to know is when we are driven by this feeling of curiosity, which I put in red, when you see curiosity and like curiosity killed the cat, this has to do with the idea of stimulus motive. So, we want to be stimulated. We're curious about the world. We want to learn more. That is stimulus motivation, or stimulus motive has to do with curiosity. All right, the next thing is drive theory. And when we look into this drive theory, you have both primary drives and secondary drives. When we are talking about things like hunger and thirst. And any of those, when we go back to talking about reinforcements, those are primary reinforcers. Similar to that, they are also primary drives. So if we are driven by food, by water, things that we need to survive, we call those primary drives. Next thing is just this idea of a sensation seeker. And when you think of a sensation seeker, essentially it is someone whose need for stimulation is higher. So they have a higher need for arousal. We would call that person a sensation seeker. They need more. They need more like highly stimulating activities. Then we have psychosocial needs. So again, as you see, interpersonal, which we talked about from the last chapter. And the thing to remember about this is if you have this overwhelming motivation and need to excel at everything that you do, this is what we call the need for achievement. So the need for achievement is when we have this need to excel at everything that we're doing. Another motivation or type, we have intrinsic and extrinsic. The things to remember about this is intrinsic motivation is when it is inside, like self-gratification. So that's a good term to remember for intrinsic self-gratification. It is inside. And then extrinsic motivation is outside. And a good thing to remember for this is wealth or money. So if you're motivated by money, that is extrinsic. If you're motivated by self-gratification, that is intrinsic. Then we get into the hierarchy of needs, and the thing to remember about this is the person who created the hierarchy of needs, this whole idea that you have this basic level of motivation that you must satisfy before you can move up. And the person who made the hierarchy of needs is Abraham Maslow. So remember that Maslow is the one who came up with the hierarchy of needs. All right, and the next thing, this is when we started talking about eating and obesity and eating disorders, and there's two things to take away on this slide, which I put in red. The first thing is this idea of set point theory, which we talked about before, and it's the whole reason why you see so many different body types and people that even though they are working out and eating healthy, they might be a little heavier than someone else. It's this whole theory of set point theory. And it's the idea that your body weight is regulated around genetically predetermined levels. So again, it is your DNA saying this is the weight that you should be at. And then it kind of regulates your body weight by that predetermined level. The other thing to know is what is the best weight loss technique. There's all sorts of things that you can do, which you see on these slides. But the thing to remember and the best way for weight loss is low-calorie, low-fat diets with exercise. There's all these kind of quick fix ones, and they are not as effective. The most effective, the best weight loss technique is low-calorie, low-fat diets with exercise. And so we also talked about eating disorders. We talked about specifically anorexia and bulimia. For the sake of the exam, I would focus more on anorexia and how it is categorized. And anorexia nervosa is categorized by dangerously low body weight. So it uses low body weight to categorize if somebody has anorexia, so an extremely low body weight. The other thing has to do with various factors that cause eating disorders, and there's a lot of them out there. So you can see it talks about social pressure is one that it talks about. These negative emotions that you can have. There's biological factors, and I know it says the hypothalamic disorder, but there's also brain abnormalities that can happen as well. This need for control is another one. So there is a lot of ones out there, but remembering the ones that are on this slide will help you. Alright, the only thing to remember about this for the sexual desires and arousal is the human sexual response cycle, and to remember that the people who came up with this was Masters and Johnson. So you will need to know those two names. So when you see the sexual response cycle, it is Masters and Johnson. So I'll go through all of this. Again, take sex class if you want to know more about that. And now we're going into emotions. You will need to know the 3 components of emotions, and so they are bodily arousal, cognitions, and expressed behavior. So those are the 3 components that make up our emotion. Then we have this idea of the facial feedback hypothesis, and essentially this is, fake it till you make it. If you mimic the facial expression, it makes you feel that emotion. So, even if you're not in a good mood, cracking a smile can actually make you feel a little happier. That is the facial feedback hypothesis. And then there's all these different theories to emotions, but the one to focus on, again, for the sake of the exam, is the James Lange theory. And this is the whole idea that the emotion comes after the bodily reaction. So you have the bodily reaction first, then you experience the emotion. So the thing to remember about the James Lange theory is that the emotion comes after the bodily reaction. And then here's all the other theories, but again, focusing on James Lange for the sake of the exam. So now we get into Chapter 9, which had to do with human development, or just developmental psychology, because it also talks about different things for animals as well. The first thing to know is this idea of maturation. And so this is the biological unfolding of an organism according to its underlying genetic blueprint, or generic blueprint. So this is the whole idea of how we change naturally based upon our genetics. That is our maturation. The next thing you will need to know is the fetal stage of human development and when that happens. And so if you see over here, it goes from week 9 through to birth. So it starts around week 9 and it goes until the baby is born. So the fetal stage is from week 9 through to birth or delivery. Next thing you need to know is the potential risk factors related to rubella. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. And so when we look at rubella, also known as German measles, the various potential risks is there's an increased risk for heart disease, deafness, and intellectual disabilities. And if you recall in class when we had our virtual babies, there was a slight chance that your baby developed deafness because you had rubella while pregnant. So remembering those risk factors for rubella. All right, next thing has to do with various reflexes. And the one that you will need to know for the exam is one that we talked about, but wasn't specifically on the PowerPoint, which is known as Babinski. Babinski is the reflex where it is the curling and fanning of a baby's toes. So their feet and toes, they'll kind of spread out and then curl up. That is known as Babinski. So infant curling and fanning of toes is Babinski. The next thing is knowing the different temperaments that a child could possess, specifically a difficult child. And when we talk about a difficult child's temperament, what we mean is, for the most part, that they are irritable. So when you see that a child is a difficult child, as far as temperament is concerned, it means that they're just generally irritable. They get irritated very easily. Then we talk about Harlow and the rhesus monkey experiment that was done. And the thing to take away from this is that what was important and crucial to development was this whole idea of contact comfort. So you didn't just need food. Children also need this idea of contact comfort. So remember contact comfort for Harlow and the monkeys experiment. Let me get into parenting styles. And again, I'm sorry that the lettering is a little off on one. In fact, it's off on the one that you will need to know. Because what you'll need to know for the exam is which of the parenting styles is the most effective as far as research is concerned. And the most effective parenting style that we have found in research is this authoritative. Be very careful on the exam. Again, authoritative with a T. Do not confuse it with authoritarian. It is authoritative, which is this whole idea that there are rules, but they're realistic. And there's an encouragement for communication. That is kind of the best of both worlds. So it seems to be the most effective parenting style. Then we get into Erik Erikson. He believed that there were different crises that you went through throughout your life. We're going to be coming back to a later one, but the one to focus on right now is when a child is around the age of 4, so in the preschool period. It is this idea of initiative versus guilt. So when you see a question about Erik Erikson and a child who's, 4 years old, what crisis they'd be going through, it would be initiative versus guilt. Now we get to Piaget. The thing to know about Piaget, because he came up with so many different theories to cognitive development. He had the stages of cognitive development, schemas, assimilation, accommodation, conservation, all these things. He is seen as the most influential theorist on cognitive development. So again, when you hear cognitive development, you want to think Piaget. And one thing that Piaget came up with is this idea of conservation. And it is this whole idea, and again, the example that I gave in the video showed some of these as well in class, is you can take 2 liquids, and you can take one glass, pour it in a glass that looks different, and those that have not mastered conservation would then say that the taller glass has more water, even though they saw it being poured. Conservation is this whole idea that even if something changes shape, it is still the same amount. So that is what we mean by conservation. It might change shape, but it is still the same amount. And then moving on from Piaget, we get to Vygotsky. And the thing to remember about Vygotsky is that he came up with this idea of the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. The way I always remember this is Vygotsky has a lot of kind of random letters in it, and so does zone of proximal development. And this is the whole idea of what a child can do, what a child can't do, and then that kind of nice sweet spot, which is the zone of proximal development, which is what a child or a person can do with help. All right, moving on into adolescence. The thing to remember about this is this idea of personal fable. And personal fable is when, again, you're kind of the main character of your own story. And so you kind of see yourself as different and special. And, things only happen to you and not other people. Other people don't understand you. You're unique. Nothing bad can happen to you. It happens to other people. That's what we mean by the personal fable. So it's that you're kind of special and like no one else. That is the personal fable. Then we get into Kohlberg. Kohlberg had the theories of moral development. And so for the sake of the exam, you'll need to know the first 2. So we have pre-conventional, which is essentially a motivation of morality based upon a fear of punishment. So when we talk about pre-conventional moral development, it is a fear of punishment. So it's physical consequences. Are you being punished for something or rewarded for something? That's your moral code. Conventional, on the other hand, is when you are motivated or when your moral compass is through a fear of the law or society. So what has society said is right and wrong, and you go by that. So pre-conventional is kind of this fear of punishment, whereas conventional is this fear of the law. Then we're kind of getting into adulthood, and so when we're looking at adulthood and various intelligences, there's this idea of fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the speed of problem solving. So how quickly you can problem solve, how quickly you can process information, that is what we mean by fluid intelligence. Whereas crystallized intelligence is just your acquired knowledge. It is the knowledge that you have. So fluid intelligence is that processing or speed, whereas crystallized intelligence is the acquired information. Then we get back to Erik Erikson. And looking at the crises that he believed that adults were going through in early adulthood and middle adulthood. And so the things to know is early or young adulthood was this idea of intimacy versus isolation. And then during middle adulthood was this idea of generativity versus stagnation. And be very careful on the exam because I believe they do it out of order, where they ask for middle adulthood first and then young adulthood. So make sure that you're reading that question carefully when you're answering it. And then the very final thing, in more ways than one, is Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of how people tend to cope with impending death. And you will just need to know the order. What are the 5 stages? So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then final acceptance. I believe that question has it where it's the odd one out. So you will just need to know what those 5 are, and you'll be able to figure it out. The only other thing, because those are all the questions that are going to be on the exam. I know I went through quickly, but again, the point of this was just doing a quick review. If you want to know it in more detail, go back to the various module lectures. But the very last thing, if I can go back, is the extra credit question. And what I would be focusing on for the extra credit question is this slide right here. So Kohlberg's theory of moral development. So there will be an extra credit question that has to do with this in some way, shape, or form. So I would make sure that you know it's Kohlberg's theory of moral development. And then that's it. So I wish you all the best of luck on this exam. I think that you guys will do fine. Again, if you have questions, send me a remind, send me a message, but do the best that you can.